Welcome the Lord's chosen. The most terrifying thing to people who operate in groups is discovering they never actually had power, only permission. Here's the part. Nobody likes to say out loud, history proves that coordinated attacks don't fail because the group lacks strength. They fail because the target stops being controllable. Empires didn't collapse from outside pressure first. They cracked the moment one individual refused to behave predictably. That's not poetry. That's documented pattern. Every system built on manipulation eventually meets someone who doesn't react on schedule, doesn't panic on cue, and doesn't fall apart when expected. That moment is never loud, but it is irreversible. This topic isn't about fantasy battles, smoke-filled rooms, or dramatic chants whispered under candlelight. It's about something far more unsettling, a coordinated effort that relied on psychology, pressure, repetition, and emotional interference and still failed. Not because you fought harder, not because you gathered reinforcements, but because you didn't fracture. That's the detail people skip, because it ruins the myth that numbers automatically win. Here's a fact that should sit with you for a second. In documented cases of group coercion, the success rate collapses when the target maintains internal consistency over time. In plain terms, when someone stays mentally aligned long enough, coordinated pressure starts to backfire. The group becomes reactive. Communication turns frantic. Mistakes multiply. Infighting begins. That's not spiritual talk. That's behavioral science. The pressure doesn't just stop working, it reverses. And that's where the shaking starts. What makes this unsettling is that nothing dramatic had to happen. No grand confrontation, no speech, no showdown, just you continuing to exist without breaking the way they calculated. That alone disrupted an entire strategy that assumed you'd crack by week 2, fold by month 3, and self-destruct right on schedule. Instead, you adapted, quietly, annoyingly, almost rudely stable. There's also a slightly funny part no one mentions. Groups like this always assume they're the smartest people in the room. They overestimate their coordination and underestimate the cost of maintaining it. You, on the other hand, didn't need meetings, updates, or emotional check-ins. You just had to stay yourself, which ironically took them more energy to monitor than it took you to live. This isn't a story about overpowering anyone. It's about outlasting a structure that couldn't survive without your participation. The moment you stopped playing your assigned role, the entire operation lost its rhythm. What you're about to hear breaks down how one person standing alone and staying internally aligned caused a coordinated effort to unravel itself, piece by piece, until fear replaced confidence and noise replaced strategy. And no, they're not shaken because you attacked them. They're shaken because you didn't. Number 1, you didn't beat them by being stronger. You beat them by being untouchable. They were prepared for resistance. That's what every coordinated attack counts on. Pushback, panic, emotional explosions, messy reactions they can exploit and redirect. Strength is predictable. Anger is predictable. Even courage can be mapped. What they were not prepared for was you being unreachable where it mattered most. Not physically, not socially, internally. That's the part no one trains for because it can't be forced or taken. You didn't win by clenching your fists harder or raising your voice. You won by removing access. Their methods depended on emotional entry points, old wounds, self-doubt, the need to explain yourself, the urge to defend your name. When none of those doors opened, the entire operation stalled. It's hard to attack someone you can't get inside of. It's even harder when they don't seem bothered by the attempt. Being untouchable doesn't mean you didn't feel anything. It means you didn't hand your feelings over for management. You processed privately instead of reacting publicly. You thought instead of spiraling. You chose not to leak your internal state to people who were actively studying you. That single decision stripped them of leverage. What really unsettled them was that you didn't become harder. You became clearer. Clear people are dangerous to manipulative systems because they don't need permission to stand where they stand. You didn't argue every lie. You didn't chase every rumor. You didn't scramble to correct every misinterpretation. You let reality catch up on its own timeline. And that patience looked like arrogance to people used to controlling outcomes. They tried pressure. You stayed steady. They tried repetition. You stayed consistent. They tried escalation. You stayed grounded. At some point it became obvious that nothing they threw at you was changing your center. That's when the energy shifted from confidence to confusion, from strategy to irritation, from certainty to fear. Untouchable doesn't mean invisible. It means unavailable to manipulation. And once they realized you couldn't be pulled, provoked, or positioned the way they needed, the fight was already over. You didn't defeat them by overpowering their force. You defeated them by making sure their force had nowhere to land. Number 2, they needed you fragmented, but you integrated instead. Their entire advantage depended on you being split inside. Not confused once in a while, not having bad days, but living in a constant state of inner division. One part of you doubting yourself while another part tried to move forward. One side still reacting to old pain while the other tried to act mature about it. That gap was supposed to be the entry point. That's where pressure works best, when someone is arguing with themselves. They counted on your past staying unresolved. Old experiences, emotional scars, moments you never fully processed. Those were meant to stay open so they could be poked and reopened at the right time. Fragmented people are easy to steer because they don't trust their own direction. If one part of you says go and another says stop, an outside voice can step in and decide for you. That's the game they were playing. But instead of staying split, you did something inconvenient for them. You started pulling yourself together. You didn't rush it, and you didn't announce it. You faced uncomfortable truths without dramatizing them. You stopped pretending certain things didn't affect you while secretly bleeding from them. You owned your reactions, your patterns, and your history without letting them define you. That's integration, and it quietly removes control from anyone watching. Once you became internally aligned, their tactics stopped landing cleanly. Emotional triggers lost precision. Mixed signals stopped working. You didn't overcorrect or overreact because there was no internal argument left to exploit. You knew why you felt what you felt, and you didn't need outside confirmation to validate it. What really disrupted them was that integration made you slower to manipulate, but faster to decide. You weren't torn between who you were and who you were becoming. You carried both honestly. That kind of internal agreement creates stability that pressure can't shake. They needed you scattered, so they could play one part of you against another. Instead, they found someone who had stitched themselves back together. And once a person becomes whole, coordinated interference turns clumsy. Not because the attacks stop, but because there's nowhere left for them to lodge. Number 3, they thought numbers would intimidate you. It only exposed their weakness. They believed the sheer amount of people involved would do the work for them. More voices, more pressure, more eyes watching. The idea was simple: overwhelm you until you second-guessed yourself. When people move in groups, they assume volume equals authority. They expect the lone person to fold just from the weight of attention. That expectation is exactly where they miscalculated. Instead of feeling small, you noticed something unsettling. None of them could stand alone. Every message sounded rehearsed. Every move needed backup. Every opinion leaned on someone else's approval. What was meant to look powerful started to look crowded. And crowded doesn't mean confident. It often means afraid of standing independently. You didn't rush to defend yourself against multiple angles. You didn't try to address every person or every claim. You understood something they didn't expect. When many people say the same thing at the same time, it doesn't automatically make it true. It makes it coordinated. And coordination is effort. Effort leaves fingerprints. The more they leaned on numbers, the clearer it became that the strength wasn't individual. Strip away the group and most of the confidence disappeared with it. That realization shifted everything. You weren't facing many strong opponents. You were facing one fragile structure pretending to be many. What really worked in your favor was how comfortable you were standing alone. You didn't need witnesses to feel grounded. You didn't need agreement to trust your position. While they kept checking in with each other, you kept moving forward. While they gathered, compared notes, and reinforced each other's stories, you stayed consistent without a committee. There's a quiet power in not needing backup. It unnerves people who survive through alliances. They couldn't tell if you were fearless or simply uninterested in their performance. Either way, intimidation failed. The numbers that were supposed to scare you ended up exposing a deeper truth. Real stability doesn't multiply itself to feel strong. It stands firm without applause. Number 4, you refused to play the role they assigned you. From the start, they decided who you were supposed to be. Not based on who you actually are, but on what made their plan work. You were meant to react a certain way, respond on cue, and stay inside a narrow box they could predict. Every move they made depended on you following that script. That's how control works. It doesn't need force if it can shape behavior. They tried to cast you as the unstable one, the difficult one, the problem that needed to be managed. At other times they needed you to look weak, confused, or desperate for approval. The role shifted depending on what benefited them most, but the goal stayed the same. Keep you performing, keep you explainable, keep you manageable. What threw everything off was your refusal to participate. You didn't correct every assumption. You didn't rush to prove who you were. You didn't argue yourself back into a role you never agreed to. That silence wasn't strategy. It was clarity. You simply stopped acting in a play that wasn't yours. When someone steps out of an assigned role, confusion spreads fast. The people enforcing the script start panicking because nothing lands the way it should. Accusations fall flat. Provocations don't spark. Even praise feels useless when it doesn't pull the right reaction. Without your cooperation, their narrative couldn't move forward. You also didn't replace their role with another one. You didn't become the rebel, the villain, or the hero. You remained undefined by their categories. That's what made this so unsettling. Most systems can handle opposition. They cannot handle disengagement from the framework itself. The longer you stayed outside their expectations, the more obvious it became that their power depended on participation. They needed you to respond emotionally, to defend yourself, to accept labels. You did none of that. You lived as if their opinions were optional, and that stripped them of authority they thought they had. By refusing the role, you exposed the truth behind the structure. It only works when everyone plays along. The moment you stopped, the entire performance started falling apart on its own. Number 5, they tried to control your image, but couldn't control your inner authority. From the very beginning, their strategy relied on rewriting your story. They spread whispers, exaggerated mistakes, and manipulated perceptions, hoping that if they shaped how everyone else saw you, they could shape how you saw yourself. That's the classic tactic. Control the narrative, control the person. But what they didn't realize is that authority doesn't live in what others think of you. It lives in what you think of yourself. You didn't waste energy defending your reputation or proving your worth. You didn't chase after every rumor or correct every false assumption. Instead, you focused on maintaining your own internal compass. Your authority came from inside, from knowing exactly who you are, what you stand for, and what lines you refuse to cross. When your center is solid, external attacks are just noise. They can't penetrate unless you let them. This drove them crazy because they had no tools for dealing with someone whose power was self-contained. Every smear they launched, every distortion they tried to enforce, failed because it collided with a mind that refused to validate it. They couldn't project fear or doubt onto you because your inner authority made those projections irrelevant. That's why their tactics started to look frantic, uncoordinated, and even desperate. They were trying to manipulate someone who wasn't playing the game. What they also didn't anticipate was how calm that kind of authority makes you. There's a subtle intimidation in quiet certainty. You don't have to shout or prove anything. Your presence, your decisions, and the way you carry yourself signal a kind of control that can't be taken, only respected or feared. They mistook their numbers and strategies for dominance, but dominance is temporary. Authority that comes from alignment and integrity is permanent. In the end, they were exposed to a truth they couldn't digest. Manipulating outward appearances is meaningless when the person behind them refuses to be shaken. You didn't just survive their efforts, you rendered their attacks useless. Every lie, every rumor, every attempt to control your image highlighted how powerless they were against the one thing they could never touch, your inner authority. Number 6, they fed on fear and you starved them without trying. Fear was their fuel. Every word, every gesture, every coordinated effort was designed to make you doubt yourself, hesitate, and react. They thrived on your uncertainty, the tension in your decisions, and the vulnerability they assumed would surface when the pressure got high. That's how systems like theirs operate. They don't need strength, they need a target willing to supply panic. But you didn't hand it over. You didn't try to show courage or force confidence. You simply stopped participating in their ecosystem. You continued to exist with the same internal logic you had always trusted. No flinching, no overcompensation, no explanations. In doing so, you starved the entire operation. They had planned for a reaction, and when none came, their machinery faltered. The subtlety of this is what made it so devastating. You weren't attacking them. You weren't proving anything. You were simply holding space for yourself. That refusal to feed into fear was like a refusal to fill their tanks. The more they pushed, the emptier their strategy became. Panic requires energy, and they had been siphoning it from you for months, or even years. When the supply ran dry, their confidence collapsed. What shook them most is that you didn't have to fight. Their intimidation relied entirely on your response. Once you became impermeable to it, their entire game turned useless. Every attempt to corner, pressure, or manipulate only highlighted their dependence on a target who would react. You weren't just unshaken, you were invisible to their agenda. And that's terrifying when you've built your sense of power on someone else's fear. This is why they're shaken now. They thought fear would control you. They assumed panic could be manufactured, emotions manipulated, and boundaries crossed. None of that worked. You starved them without effort simply by refusing to supply the one thing that sustained them, your insecurity. And when the energy that built their confidence dries up, what remains isn't strength, it's desperation. Number 7. They confused your patience for powerlessness. They watched you and assumed that because you didn't react immediately, because you didn't over-explain, because you didn't lunge at every provocation, you were weak. They thought your patience was a gap they could exploit, a delay in your defense that would eventually crack open. They mistook stillness for surrender, observation for submission. That miscalculation became their undoing. What they didn't realize is that patience is not passivity. You weren't waiting because you didn't know what to do. You were waiting because you were fully aware of the stakes and the patterns at play. Every interaction, every manipulation, every attempt to pressure you was being catalogued, measured, and analyzed. While they assumed you were slow, you were already ahead. You were learning, calculating, and preparing in silence. That's what made you dangerous in ways they couldn't anticipate. Patience gave you space to observe weaknesses in their coordination. It allowed you to see where the cracks were, where they contradicted themselves, where their unity depended on fear or manipulation. The longer you remained calm, the more their energy became exposed. Frustration seeped in, coordination faltered, confidence wavered. What they thought was a lull in your response was actually a process of quietly dismantling the foundation they were standing on. Your patience also showed them that you didn't need external validation. They expected their tactics to trigger fear, confusion, or anger. When none appeared, it forced them to confront the reality that control is only as strong as the willingness of the target to be controlled. Their strategies weren't failing because they weren't smart. They were failing because you refused to hand over your emotional energy, which is the only thing that makes manipulation work. In the end, your patience wasn't a pause. It was a signal. It said you weren't playing their game on their terms. You weren't reactive. You weren't predictable. And that level of composure in the face of relentless pressure revealed a truth they could neither argue with nor ignore. Patience can be more destructive to manipulators than aggression ever could. It's silent, calculated, and impossible to weaponize against the person wielding it correctly. Number 8, you survived exposure without becoming corrupted by it. They assumed that being exposed to coordinated darkness would change you, that constant pressure, manipulation, and intrusion would leave marks that could be used, amplified, or turned against you. Most people who face this kind of intensity either collapse, adopt the tactics used against them, or slowly harden into someone unrecognizable. But you didn't. You moved through it without picking up their toxicity, without letting the chaos rewrite your character. Every attack, every whisper, every attempt to manipulate was an invitation to react in ways that would validate them. You could have grown bitter, vengeful, or cunning in response. You could have let fear or anger dictate your actions, but instead, you maintained your core integrity. That is what truly unsettled them. They weren't just measuring your reactions, they were measuring your susceptibility. And what they found was nothing they could exploit. Surviving exposure is not about pretending nothing happened. It's about processing without contamination. You acknowledge the presence of darkness without letting it define your trajectory. You didn't absorb their drama, adopt their lies, or become the reflection they hoped to see in you. That refusal to carry their energy back with you made every attempt to break you ineffective. It wasn't just survival, it was a demonstration of sovereignty. The more they pressed, the more they realized that exposure had no leverage over you. Every plan they built on the assumption that intensity would erode your principles crumbled because principles are not negotiable. They are lived, not performed. You existed in the same environment, faced the same assaults, but emerged without the fingerprints of their interference on your soul. That is why they are shaken. They counted on you becoming a version of yourself that they could manipulate, predict, or fear. Instead, you emerged intact, untainted, and unbreakable, not because you avoided them, but because you refused to adopt their energy as your own. The very thing designed to consume you ended up highlighting your indestructibility, and that is a reality they cannot reconcile. Number 9. They wanted you isolated, but you became internally sovereign. They counted on isolation. That's one of the oldest tactics in coordinated manipulation. Remove support, cut off perspectives, make the target feel alone, and suddenly control becomes easier. Loneliness is supposed to weaken people, make them desperate for approval, make them bend to narratives they would normally reject. That was their assumption, that without backup, without witnesses, without validation, you'd falter. What they didn't anticipate is that isolation doesn't have to create weakness. For some, it becomes a crucible, a space where internal authority grows. You didn't crumble because no one was watching. You didn't panic because there were no allies to lean on. Instead, you used the distance to consolidate yourself, to become self-contained, to build a sovereignty that no one could touch. Where they saw vulnerability, you quietly cultivated power. Internal sovereignty is dangerous to manipulative systems because it removes leverage. Nothing they could do or say could provoke a reaction strong enough to manipulate outcomes. They had relied on you needing connection, needing validation, needing affirmation from outside sources. You no longer needed any of it. Your decisions, your emotions, your boundaries existed independent of them, and that independence made them frantic. The brilliance of this is that you didn't just survive being alone, you thrived in it. Every attempt to intimidate or control you bounced off because your center was solid, fully aligned, and inaccessible to their interference. Their whispers, strategies, and coordinated pressure became irrelevant because your alignment didn't rely on consensus or approval. You didn't just hold your ground. You owned your space in a way that no crowd, no gang, and no orchestrated force could invade. By becoming internally sovereign, you turned isolation into armor. The tactic designed to weaken you exposed their own weakness instead. They relied on numbers, coordination, and influence, but none of it mattered against someone who no longer required their input to exist, decide, or endure. In the end, your solitude didn't make you small. It made you untouchable. Number 10. They attacked you repeatedly because one victory wasn't enough. They came at you again and again because they assumed one strike, one manipulation, one moment of pressure would eventually force you to break. But when it didn't, their approach didn't shift. It escalated. Repetition was their strategy, and persistence was their weapon. They believed that the cumulative effect of multiple attacks would wear you down, that their coordinated force could eventually crack even the strongest defenses. What they didn't anticipate is that repeated attacks reveal more about the attacker than the target. Every time they tried, they exposed impatience, desperation, and over-reliance on pattern. Each new attempt wasn't a sign of your weakness. It was a sign of their instability. They thought quantity could compensate for quality, that repeated pressure could make up for the lack of substance or alignment in their plan. They didn't see that persistence without strategy is just noise, and that noise only amplifies the clarity of someone who knows themselves. You didn't react in predictable ways. You didn't spiral into fear or anger. You didn't chase every narrative or try to prove your position repeatedly. Instead, you allowed each attempt to demonstrate its own futility. Your consistency, your composure, and your refusal to validate their efforts made every strike highlight their incompetence. They were trying to move you, but you had already moved internally. Repeated attacks also forced them to reveal patterns they thought were hidden. Every angle they struck from, every manipulation they coordinated, gave you more insight into their methods, their weaknesses, and their reliance on control. You learned more from their persistence than they could ever learn from their success. They kept coming because they couldn't accept that one person, standing firmly in alignment, couldn't be broken by volume, intimidation, or repetition. And with each failure, their confidence eroded while yours strengthened. In the end, their repeated attacks didn't build pressure. They built proof of your invulnerability. One victory was never enough for them, but it only confirmed that you didn't need one at all. Number 11. They discovered you can't be controlled through trauma anymore. Their most insidious tool was trauma. They counted on it to bend you, shape you, and predict your responses. Past wounds, emotional scars, moments of pain they assumed were still raw. These were the hooks they expected to pull on, the levers they thought could dictate your decisions. Trauma is an invisible chain that most people carry everywhere, and manipulators exploit it relentlessly. They believed you were still carrying theirs, ready to be influenced and steered. But you had changed the rules of engagement. You refused to let past pain dictate your present. You acknowledged what happened, processed it on your own terms, and refused to hand that power back to them. Trauma lost its ability to move you because you no longer needed it to explain yourself, justify your actions, or validate your choices. Where they expected fear, hesitation, or overreaction, they found calm, clarity, and unwavering presence. That was a shock to their system. By reclaiming your emotional autonomy, you turned their weapon into impotence. Every attempt to trigger old wounds fell flat. Every manipulation designed to exploit insecurity failed. You became unpredictable not because you were reckless, but because your foundation was untouchable. You had broken the pattern they depended on, and once that happens, their entire strategy unravels quietly but completely. The terrifying thing for them was that this wasn't performance. You weren't pretending to be unaffected. You weren't masking pain or faking strength. You had actually crossed a threshold. Past experiences no longer had authority over your decisions or your boundaries. Their control depended on a predictable response. When the response didn't come, confusion and panic took its place. They realized too late that you had mastered what they couldn't master themselves. Surviving trauma without becoming reactive, defensive, or manipulative. That truth shattered their confidence because it proved a single person could exist fully, whole, and sovereign even under conditions designed to break them. And in that realization, you became more than unbreakable. You became irrelevant to the very tactics that were supposed to dominate you. Number 12, you didn't win the war, you ended their relevance. Most people think victory means defeating the enemy, overpowering them, or proving a point. That's what they expected from you. That one dramatic moment, one big confrontation, would decide the outcome. But you operated on a completely different level. You didn't play the game the way they thought it had to be played. You didn't need to win in their terms because the entire war depended on your participation. Once you withdrew from their expectations, their influence collapsed. Ending relevance is more powerful than winning because it removes the battlefield entirely. You didn't need to argue, fight, or even expose every lie. By choosing not to react according to their script, you demonstrated that their efforts were meaningless. The strategies, the coordination, the energy they invested, it all depended on you taking it seriously. Once you stepped out of their frame, all their planning became irrelevant. That's what shook them more than any victory could. Their power existed only in relation to you, and you refused to validate it. What they failed to understand is that control is relational. They could coordinate, intimidate, and manipulate as much as they wanted, but none of it has weight without the target's engagement. By refusing to give them that engagement, you didn't just survive, you made their influence evaporate. Their entire reason for existing in your space, their purpose, was nullified without a single clash. You didn't defeat them, you made them unnecessary. That kind of result is disorienting because it breaks the usual narrative. People are used to measuring success in conflict by wins, losses, or responses. You rewrote the equation. By showing that your stability, clarity, and independence didn't rely on their approval or pressure, you turned the entire structure into noise. They weren't just frustrated. They were exposed as redundant, overcomplicated, and irrelevant. In the end, the war they thought they were winning was never about battle. It was about control. By stepping outside of it entirely, you didn't win in the conventional sense. You rendered the conflict meaningless, and that is far more devastating than any single victory could ever be. Number 13. They're shaking because you're still standing without explaining yourself. Nothing unsettles manipulators more than someone who doesn't feel the need to justify their existence. They thrive on explanations, confessions, and performances of guilt or fear because those are the points they can control. Every lie, every accusation, every manipulation is meant to provoke a reaction that validates their narrative, but you refuse to give them that satisfaction. You stood, unshaken, unhurried, and completely uninterested in performing for anyone else's approval. That refusal to explain yourself destroyed their expectations. They were expecting noise, an argument, an emotional eruption, anything that would confirm their power. When it didn't come, panic set in. Silence became louder than any reaction could ever be. They tried to interpret your composure as weakness, your calm as uncertainty, your neutrality as fear. Every misread signal forced them to confront the fact that their influence over you was evaporating, and the more they pressed, the clearer it became. Your presence didn't require justification. By not explaining yourself, you shifted the entire energy dynamic. The attacks that were supposed to shape you instead shaped them. Every whisper, rumor, or attempt to provoke you backfired, revealing desperation and incompetence instead of authority. They couldn't control a story that you refused to narrate, and their frustration grew with every unresponsive moment. You were the constant in a sea of manipulation, and that constancy became a mirror reflecting their instability. What makes this even more disarming is that your silence isn't passive, it's active power. Standing without explanation signals self-possession. It communicates that your decisions, your boundaries, and your integrity exist independently of outside opinion. And manipulators who survive by engineering reactions find this unbearable. They are shaking because the control they relied on was contingent on your cooperation. You didn't just survive their attempts, you nullified their influence entirely. Your composure forced them to confront a truth they cannot change. Your existence doesn't need validation, and that is a reality that terrifies those who live off other people's reactions. Number 14, you proved that one aligned individual is more dangerous than a coordinated lie. They had numbers, strategies, and coordination on their side, and they believed that was enough. They counted on repetition, reinforcement, and collective pressure to dominate, assuming a single person could never match the force of many. That's where they miscalculated. What they didn't realize is that alignment, true internal alignment, cannot be measured, multiplied, or manipulated. It is invisible, unpredictable, and unstoppable in ways they could never anticipate. While they relied on lies, gossip, and coordinated attempts to destabilize you, you relied on coherence. Every decision, every response, every thought flowed from the same unshakable center. That kind of consistency is more powerful than any number of voices screaming in unison. Lies can spread quickly, but they crumble when faced with someone whose life is governed by truth and self-clarity. One aligned individual exposes every weakness in a coordinated deception, because deception depends on doubt and confusion. You had neither. Their coordinated efforts became a liability because they assumed cohesion where there was none. Each participant needed reinforcement from the others. Each plan required constant monitoring. Their energy was tied up in maintaining the illusion of power, while you, standing alone, didn't need anyone to prop you up. The contrast between their frantic interdependence and your independent alignment was jarring, and that shock destabilized them far more than any argument or confrontation could have. They also didn't anticipate the speed at which internal alignment makes someone untouchable. You could move, decide, and act without waiting for consensus. You didn't require approval or permission to exist fully and to hold your boundaries. That flexibility in action, combined with unwavering consistency in self, created a paradox they couldn't resolve. How can one person dismantle what hundreds of coordinated efforts couldn't? In the end, the truth was simple and terrifying for them. Numbers don't beat integrity, and coordination doesn't beat clarity. You weren't just surviving their schemes. You were proving a fundamental rule they could never accept. Alignment is stronger than any lie, and one person who lives fully in it is unstoppable. Conclusion. What you just witnessed isn't a story of brute force or dramatic confrontations. It's a story of something far more powerful, something they couldn't predict, calculate, or control. A single individual who refused to be manipulated, fractured, or defined by anyone else's agenda. You didn't need to fight on their terms, you didn't need to respond to every attack, and you didn't need to perform for approval. Every move they made, every plan they coordinated, every attempt to break you fell apart because your power wasn't in reaction. It was in alignment. You survived exposure without absorbing their toxicity. You starved their strategies by refusing to feed them fear. You stood calm, patient, and sovereign, while they scrambled to understand how one person could resist what a gang believed should have crushed them. They relied on your reactions, your divisions, your insecurities, and your trauma, but you refused to give them any of it. And in doing so, you didn't just survive. You turned their attacks into evidence of their own weakness, their reliance on control, and their irrelevance. The most shocking truth for them is this: they counted on your participation in their game, and when you stopped playing, the entire structure collapsed without a single confrontation. Numbers, repetition, and coordinated deception could not touch you. Lies and manipulation fell flat. Your alignment made you untouchable, unpredictable, and quietly devastating. One person, living fully in clarity and sovereignty, proved more powerful than a network built on fear and pretense. Let this sink in. True power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need applause, validation, or retaliation. It exists in composure, integrity, and refusal to be drawn into someone else's chaos. You didn't just survive the pressure, the lies, or the attacks. You exposed the truth that no coordinated effort can overpower an aligned soul. That is the reason they are shaken. That is why their strategies failed. And that is why your presence alone rewrote the rules of engagement. If this video spoke to you, resonated, or gave you the clarity you've been searching for, make sure to show your support. Subscribe to the channel to never miss insights that cut deeper than surface-level advice. Like the video to help spread the message. Comment your thoughts or experiences below to join the conversation. And share it with someone who needs to see how alignment truly dismantles manipulation. You've witnessed the truth. Now let it empower you and others. Stay blessed always.